Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. It's the first event for 2014 for the University of Kansas Federalist Society. If you don't know, the Federalist Society is a conservative and libertarian intellectual network, and we're interested in the state of legal order. Primarily, we function based on the belief that the state exists to preserve freedom, separation of powers is central to our form of government, and that the province and the duty of the judiciary is to say what the law is, not what it should be. Today, we have the pleasure of having Dave Trabert and Joan Wagnon speak on the Kansas budget and whether or not it's working. And Dave is the president of the Kansas Policy Institute. He frequently speaks to business and legislative and civic groups. He's testified before the Kansas House and Senate committees. He's an appointed member of the Kansas K-12 Achievement and Efficiency Commission. He serves on the Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force and co-chairs the Education Finance Joint Working Group for the American Legislative Exchange Council. And he's published many works, including student-focused funding for public funding solutions for public education. And his most recent report that we'll talk to you about today is a 5-year budget plan for the state of Kansas. You guys welcome Dave Trabert to the stage.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Federalist Society for putting on this event. It may be one of the few, if not the first, public discussion of multiple sides of this Kansas budget issue. I also want to thank Joan Wagnon for being here because it is truly a challenge to have a civil discussion about these issues that's not one-sided. And having this opportunity to come out and discuss this, whether you agree or not, is not the point. I think it's more to make sure that everybody has all the information they need to make their own fully informed decision, and then so you can decide what you think is best going forward and not have to rely on whatever people say. A lot of the work that we do, whether it's in this case on tax and budget or education or a number of other issues we focus on, comes down to helping people sort through false choices. And the Kansas budget issue is a classic case of a false choice, which comes from government at all levels in our experience. The false choice in this case being choosing between higher taxes or less services. Most of what we try to do, a great deal of it, comes down to helping people work through those. It's not a false choice between high tax or low service or less service. It's how do we do both, and we can. It's not easy to do, but it can be done, and that's the focus. We don't have choices between one bad thing or another. We find out how we can do both. So the plan that we put together, and I'm going to get to that in a few minutes, but the plan we put together does exactly that. It shows how we can balance the Kansas budget without any more tax increases, without any service reductions. We can continue to fund, actually we left in increases in the plan. This is built on what Kansas Legislative Research has done. We left $200 million more, $215 million for education, $299 million more for Medicaid. We're able to do this and still have good ending balances by making better use of government resources. Now, I want to go through those elements first, but first I want to spend just a few minutes going through a little of the rationale why tax reform is needed in Kansas, and talk about a little bit about some of the things that you may have heard that simply aren't true, or at least not be the entire story. What you see here is a comparison. This is a 15-year economic comparison, and most, except for the domestic migration, we only had that back in 2000. There is a remarkable difference in economic performance among states that have low tax burdens and high tax burdens. Now I don't want anyone to misunderstand. I'm not saying that taxes are the only thing that matters, but it's undeniable, this remarkable difference between states, whether it's states that tax income or don't, states the highest and lowest state and local tax burden. That's as ranked by the Tax Foundation, which is kind of a measure, it's kind of an affordability index. They put a tax burden, their definition of tax burden is taxes paid as a percentage of available income. The best and worst economic performance from another publication, Rich States, Poor States, And then down here you can see Kansas. And you can see that over the last 15 years, Kansas has trailed, in many cases, even some of the worst performers. Where, for example, we had 3.9% job growth, private sector, over a 15-year period, where the states that tax income were 5.6, the states that had a high state and local tax burden, 7.9. We're all across the board. You see remarkably better economic performance. Domestic migration is U.S. residents moving in and out of states. These are people who are choosing to move for whatever reason. And again, you see that the low-burden states have positive migration. They're gaining. The high-burden states are losing. Not in every single case, but when you look at the overall mix, it's undeniable that there is an economic advantage to having lower taxes, and that's simply economics. The more you have to spend on something, whether it's your rent or your utilities or food, the less you have to spend on something else. A certain amount of taxation is absolutely necessary, but every dollar that is taxed unnecessarily is a dollar that's not available either to fund a service or that didn't get spent in the economy elsewhere. Now, here's the flip side of this. There were 11 states since 1960 that implemented an income tax. They didn't have it, it happened at different times. All 11 states, every single one, has a smaller share of state GDP than it did 5 years before implementing that tax. And this might really get your attention. They didn't have an income tax, and then they did. And now, even though they have a brand new tax source, they have a smaller share of state and local tax revenue relative to their competitors. So we know that every single time, the states that implemented an income tax had an economic consequence as a result. Now, you've probably heard a lot about trailing the national average, and Kansas is trailing the national average. As you saw in the previous slides, we've been doing that for a long time. The purpose of this is to show kind of the hypocrisy of media and others who are saying that Kansas is trailing the national average, therefore tax reform has failed. Yes, Kansas has been trailing the national average, but where was the hue and cry about trailing the national average when we were trailing it much more? It wasn't there. This is not about whether or not tax reform is failing. These are political issues. They're not economic issues. Now, as my grandfather, he would have said it more colorfully, but tax reform, trailing the national average isn't evidence. It's like, okay, I'll clean it up for you. No kidding, Dick Tracy. That's the reason we did this. We've been trailing the national average for a long time. We're trying to stop it. We see that states that let citizens keep more of their money and have good quality services are doing better. This can't happen overnight. Now, it was wrong of people, including Governor Brownback, to say that this would be a shot of adrenaline. Over time, yes, I think it will, and the evidence shows there will be a strong economic benefit, but you cannot stop decades of economic stagnation overnight. That just cannot happen, especially when you have a national economy that was coming out of a recession, and you have federal policies coming in place that are discouraging employment growth. Anybody know what a 49er is? Not the football team. Yes?
People who left the rest of the states to go to California during the California Gold Rush?
That may be. In this case, a 49er is an employer that has 49 employees. Because when they go to 50 employees, the impact of Obamacare kicks in. And they have a whole new set of restrictions that are forced upon them because of Obamacare. Anybody know what a 29er is? A 29er is an employee who's working 29 hours because the benefits kick in at 30. So what you're finding, because of the Obamacare, is forcing employers to make decisions to not raise wages, to try to raise hours, to try to find ways to stop having these impacts. So, there's no way that this was going to ever happen overnight. It will happen over time. But we can't be distracted, I don't think, by political embellishments. Frankly, if we focused on political embellishments, I don't know that we'd ever get anything else done, because that's kind of a bipartisan problem. The early signs are encouraging, and this is not to say tax reform is working. It's way too early to say that. Just like it's way too early to say tax reform isn't working. The early signs show that while you saw we were trailing our peers on gross domestic product, we actually beat the national average in 2013. And where you saw that Kansas was at 70% of our income taxing peers on private sector job creation, we were at 82% last year. And so far through 2014 at 85%. Nowhere near where we want to be, definitely moving in the right direction, thank goodness. We've also had 2 consecutive years of new business applications. And that's the reason it's so important to look at the number of new applications as opposed to the net number is because one of your own professors here at KU, Dr. Art Hall, went back and looked at the life cycle of businesses. And what he found was that if it had not been for the jobs created by new startups, and whether that's a new Walmart opening or it's, Joan and I opened a sandwich shop together, it's the jobs coming from a new startup. If it hadn't been for those new jobs, Kansas would have had 2 years of job growth between 1977 and 2010. Yes?
How does that measure startups? Does that include existing businesses that are shifted to an LLC, or does that include
This would be a new business application
for under the Small Business Center?
at the Secretary of State's office. Just today, I found this map released by the Bureau of Economic Analysis that showed that Kansas had the 14th best growth rate of personal income in the second quarter of this year. Now, as I said, it's too early to call tax reform a success. It's going to be years before we can really do a look back and say how well did it do. What we're seeing here is an awful lot of political interest in wanting to see tax reform fail. The New York Times, here was a quote they said where they think that government needs a lot of money to nurture growth. Now, we think there's a role for government to play in not discouraging growth. And government certainly needs money to operate. But the push here, and it was even more clearly pushed by the Washington Post when they said, basically, they don't want any other states to get these ideas. And you can see the language they use. It's pretty derogatory. Not an honest evaluation of what's going on. For example, the New York Times falsely said that Kansas has cut K-12 spending by 2% over the last 2 school years. You can see the numbers there for yourself. Kansas continues to have set records on K-12 funding. Set records in 2012, 13, 14, and this year we're going to pass $13,000 per student. Since we got started, if we could, I'd like to take, I shouldn't have done that, but let me handle questions afterwards. I want to make sure Joan has enough time and move through this. Now, some people say, well, but that funding went to things that don't get to the classroom. So we took the Kansas Association of School Boards' definition of educational programs, used their definition, went back to 2005, and there it is compared to inflation. We're $339 million ahead of inflation on funding for what the school board calls. And there would be a lot of disagreement perhaps over what should or shouldn't be included, but the Kansas Association of School Boards' definition of educational programs shows that we're running well ahead of inflation. Now, this one ought to be near and dear to your hearts. The Times said that Kansas has cut higher education by 3% since 2012. If you go look at the Kansas division of the budget, you'll find that that's not true. The 2-year period they were talking about, funding for higher education actually increased. And you'll see that this year it's set for $794.1 million. Kansas City Star said that Moody's, quote, cited Kansas' risky tax plan. They did not. What they said was, you have a structural imbalance. When you cut taxes, you didn't cut spending. They don't care. All that bond rating agencies care about is, can you pay your bills? Whether you have high taxes and high spending or low taxes and low spending, can you pay your bills? They never said risky tax plan, but that's what media wants you to hear. And despite what the Washington Post or Mother Jones or a lot of local media is saying, Kansas is not facing a $1.3 billion deficit. That's a fabricated story, and we have a handout in the back where we did a lengthy blog post explaining how that is fabricated. Let me show you the short math on it. The first column here, spending adjustments to maintain zero balance, Kansas legislative research. So that totals $482 million over 5 years. How do you get to $1.3 billion? Well, you count the first one 4 times. When you cut money from the budget, it's gone. You don't have to cut it again. They count it 4 times. If you, the next one they count 3 times and 2 times and 1 time. So, and the truth is, as you'll see, if you just adjust the base at the beginning, it's even less than 482 million, as you'll see when we get into our plan. This is how this gets fabricated. The legislative research used to put out a report that had that number, would have had that number on it. They stopped using that methodology because they said, and it's in our blog post, it gave the false impression of deficits that won't occur. But we have a situation in Kansas where legislators are allowed to ask legislative research to do something based on their own methodology. And they do it, and they provide it, and then someone else runs out and says, look, we're going to have a $1.3 billion deficit. And they know that's not true. But they have a piece of paper, and media will look at it, and that's all that matters. Now, we were $232 million shy. The number that you've heard in the press was like $338 million. That's after they increased the estimate in April, because revenues were running ahead of estimate for 7 of the previous 9 months. So if you don't count that, I mean, if you look at the estimate upon which the budget was based, it was more like a $232 million shortfall, most of which was probably due to capital gains. Truth is, no one knows how much, because you have to get IRS data to get that information, and they're usually about 2 years behind providing it. But when you were running behind estimates, running ahead of estimates for many months, and then you have a 2-month period of bad shortfalls, and then it kind of goes back to almost normal, there's a pretty good case to be made, especially when other states have experienced that most of that was probably, we really don't know how much, but we were off about 4%. The problem we have with the Kansas budget is we spent too much. When you reduced revenues in 2012, when tax reform, which went into effect in 2013, we should have had some, which is basically what the bond rating services are saying, you should have made some adjustments to spending. There was bipartisan resistance to do it. There certainly were a few legislators who wanted to make some adjustments, but the will to bring, basically to force government to operate efficiently, as you'll see, just isn't there. And that will be the biggest challenge going forward, to force government to operate a little more efficiently. And we'll show you how. By the way, here's a little history on the general fund spending. If we had increased the general fund for inflation and population since 1990, we'd be spending $1.156 billion less today. You can see where we went way ahead of inflation in the past. Basically never kept, we're running ahead of it. But that gives you an idea. We are not going to be talking about spending any kind of draconian cuts. You'll see that we're actually going to go up. Here's the key, and this is frankly, when tax reform was first brought up, there were even a lot of conservatives who came to us and said, look, we love the idea of reducing taxes, but how's government going to operate? We went out and looked at what all 50 states spent, and what we found was kind of that D8 moment. Well, duh, it just comes down to how much they spend. Look at these remarkable differences. Can anyone name a state that doesn't have public education, highway, social service programs, higher education, and so forth? I can't. They all have them. They all have them. The states that tax income spend 49% more per resident providing those services. The states with the highest local tax burden in the state and local spend 40%. The states that had the worst versus the best economic performance spent 40% more per resident to provide the same basic basket of services. States that spend less, tax less, and as we saw at the beginning, they actually grow more. Here's our 5-year budget plan. And what we've done here is take the legislative research 5-year profile. is what they call it. It looks like a 5-year forecast, as you'll see. We allowed revenues to grow at the same rate they did. We believe, and I think a lot of people believe, when the revenue estimates come out, see, in Kansas, you only officially estimate revenues twice a year, in November and April. When they were estimated in April, that was before anything was known, at least to the people doing the estimates, about the capital gains shortfall. So that's kind of baked into the future. They haven't adjusted for that. So there's a pretty good chance that when the November group gets back together, revenues will come down somewhat. And so we didn't want to just show you, here's our plan against current estimates. So what we've shown it against is a small reduction, kind of a medium-sized reduction, and a large reduction. So you can see how it works against all these different scenarios. And then what we do is just adjust the beginning, and then let the future rise at the same percentage chosen by legislative research. We've kept all their spending in place, including $215 million more they estimate for K-12. That's not papers, that's just other education dollars, including $299 million for Medicaid caseload increases. We don't have any service reductions in here. We don't have zero ending balances. We have gradually increasing healthy ending balances. And you'll see much more than we probably need, but that's just the way the math works. And even if in our largest reduction, which would over 5 years take $1.2 billion out of revenue, we still only have to make government operate less than 5% more efficiently after implementing our plan. Now, when I've done this before, and I ask people in a public setting, does anyone, what do you think? Does government operate pretty efficiently? I used to have to wait for the laughter to die down before we can move on. We're talking about a very tiny change in how government operates, and it's by using that better service, better price mentality that we talk about. It's about finding ways to provide the same or better quality service at a better price. It's not about eliminating service. That's that false choice. I mean, frankly, no one's going to come or stay for low-cost, lousy service. We have to do both. And obviously, we find a lot of states that figure out how to do that. No matter which revenue scenario we look at, under our plan, we would continue to set spending records in Kansas. You've heard draconian cuts. You've heard devastating cuts. Doesn't have to happen. Our plan shows how we would still have record-setting spending. Maybe not as much as on the dashed line, which is in the legislative research forecast, but certainly higher spending. Now, let me see if I can very quickly shoot over here, because I want to show you this one. It's going to be easier if I do this. Oops, hold on. I want to show you here, build your own budget. This module is going to be added to our website either today or tomorrow, because we want everybody to be able to play with these numbers and see what happens, because probably a lot of you wouldn't be able to do all the things that we have in our plan. But this all works out to making better use of existing resources. Let me start with this one. Transfer KDOT fund balance. You may have heard about how legislators, it's called robbing the bank of KDOT. Well, that gets headlines. What it amounts to is taking back surpluses. The Department of Transportation builds up surpluses. And they do that from one or two ways, and it's probably a combination of both. You either get more revenue than you need to fulfill your projects, and or the cost of those projects are coming in less than necessary. See, what most people don't understand is there's an awful lot of things in the Kansas budget that's never seen. Well, Joan's been there. $500 million in sales tax is taken right off the top and given to the Department of Transportation. It never goes through the budget, ever. So these surpluses, there's actually a lot more. We could take $150 million back from the KDOT surplus and still have all the cash they need for bond payment obligations and an operating surplus. We never say take away government's surplus or reserve balances. Everybody needs some. The question is how much. So when we're looking at this next one, reduce this KDOT sales tax transfer. In 2013, the Department of Transportation was getting about $330 million off the top. Starting in 2013, that bumped up to about $500 million. Now, they were running surpluses when they were getting $330 million off the top. So what this is suggesting is, as a default, let's drop back to where we were in 2013. And then let's have the legislature do an honest-to-goodness budget evaluation of the transportation plan of what's not done yet. None of this, in our estimation, and we did this in conjunction with former State Budget Director Steve Anderson. Steve works for us on a part-time basis, now on a contract basis. Steve's had extensive conversations, and from both from when he's been in the government and since, none of this indicates we wouldn't be able to do any of the projects. What this is looking at is we would never, if we did this, we'd never be robbing the Bank of KDOT anymore because we wouldn't be giving them the extra money and having surpluses. We also know that since the T-Works plan was put into place, costs have come down dramatically. We have a transportation secretary who has found ways to operate his department much more efficiently, and now he also has the ability to work through the Turnpike Authority. So there's a lot more cost-sharing opportunities that exist than before. Now, if you see, look down here to the bottom, you'll see now, see if I can do this right. Here we go. 17% ending balance, $1.1 billion. So it's not like all this has to be done. We deliberately put a lot more in this plan that needs to be done to give legislators and citizens a lot of options. So, here, let me show you. We could just wipe this out completely. We still have an $852 million ending balance. So it's not like this stuff has to be done in order to avoid service reductions. These are options. This is the way the budget process should work. It usually doesn't, and not just in Kansas. But let me go on down very quickly through some of these others. The Kansas Bioscience, in statute, the Bioscience Authority is supposed to get $35 million a year. That's not what the funding level has been for some time. But because it's in statute, legislative research has to reserve $35 million. So what we're saying here is fund them at the level they were getting, which is $10 million. But this is a two-step process. It takes out the $35 million and puts down in here, here's where we add back the current funding. So now it's transparent. Now you're going to see how much we're spending on the Bioscience Authority. This is one of those accounting gimmicks. I mean, this is just taking money off the table we don't have to set aside. Freeze Peak, that's a subsidy program for select employers, where if they meet certain criteria, they get to keep a large chunk of withholding taxes. There's a paper put out by Professor Nathan Jensen who looked at the Peak study, Peak program, and found that these subsidies, companies that get them are no more likely to create new jobs than the companies that didn't get them. So we're saying freeze it where the Peak program is, eliminating another job creation that's another tax subsidy for business. Put capers, new hires into basically a 401k program. And you can see the savings the savings on that actually grow much larger into the future. And this is based off of an actuarial study that sits now in the Budget Department's office. Federal reimbursement of paper, we leave $21 million a year on the table because our school districts don't have a payroll system sophisticated enough to track the data that the feds want. They will not accept. So basically, let's say if I was a food service worker and working on federally funded food programs, the state is allowed to get reimbursement for not only my pay, but all my benefits. But you can't estimate the cost of my retirement. It has to be shown in the payroll system. That's the federal rule. A lot of our districts don't have a sophisticated enough payroll system to do that. So we lose $21 million a year in federal reimbursement. What we need is either a statewide payroll system or change those payroll systems. And frankly, even if we had to spend a few $1 million up front to do that, we're way ahead of the game. So there's more revenue. Then the last two are capturing some money sitting on the sidelines. This is all explained in much greater detail in our budget plan that's in the back of the room. School districts increased their carryover cash balances by about $430 million between 2005 and 2013. Not bond money, not capital outlay, operating funds. That's money that they were given from state and local taxes to run school districts, and $430 million of it went to increase cash reserves. So what we're talking about here is taking a portion of the increase and reducing state aid to schools one time, which doesn't reduce their resources. They just pull that $147 million out of their cash balances, which would still leave them with $740 million in operating cash balances. And the last one is about college tuition. Universities collected $76 million more of tuition from you between 2002 and 2014 than they spent. And we know this because they put tuition dollars into one fund. It's called general fees fund. When you look at these government funds operate like checkbooks. The balances go up if you put more in than you can take out. We see these balances going up. They went from $12 million across the 6 universities to 12 plus 76, $88 million. So what we're suggesting in our plan is to reduce state aid to school, to universities one time by half that amount, about $37 million, or $38 million, and maybe let you all have the other $38 million. Kind of a tuition holiday reduction, however they want to do it. It's laid out in our paper. It varies by school. K-State had the biggest increase. I think they had about $26 million out of the total. But all of this is all about making better use of existing resources. Some of it's one-time stuff, and that's good because that buys, the legislature needs a lot of time to do the work they should have been doing over the years to find out ways to operate government more efficiently. So you can go through here and you can change here. Let's do a, real quick. Here's a very large revenue reduction. We just took $1.2 billion out of revenue over a 5-year period. And if you put our plan in place, what do you have? A 14.7% ending balance of $941 million. You clearly don't have to do all of this. This is designed to give everybody an opportunity to say, well, I don't like some of that, or maybe some of this is too far. Maybe take-up does need a little bit more money. This is the way we can approach this because it's about providing you with a better service at a better price. Now, I will stop there. I think I kind of did that. So I'm getting my signal over here. Thank you.
Give Dave a hand. We also have the pleasure of having Joan Wagnon give commentary today. She's the current chair of the Democratic Party in Kansas. She's formerly mayor of Topeka, served in the state legislature for 12 years, was the secretary of the Kansas Department of Revenue, was the president of Central National Bank, and an executive director of Kansas Families for Kids at the YMCA, among many other things. Quite a resume. She has a few things to hand out. She'll give us a brief commentary on Steve's talk. After Steve talks, we'll try and have a few minutes for questions. It won't be a lot. We'll try and have a few minutes for
Thank you. Okay, I have a very low-tech presentation. I have handouts. And I'm sorry that my friend Dwayne Gossett, who was the budget director of the state of Kansas for 3 governors, is not here because he's really the numbers guy. I was always the tax person. So my comments are going to focus a little bit on the tax implications of some of these things. But the topic that was on your bulletin outside said, is the Kansas budget plan working? And I presume that meant the current Kansas budget plan. And I'm here to tell you that it is not. And what is coming around is an article that was written by Dwayne Gossett, and also a property tax piece that I'll talk about in a minute. But on the back of that article that's coming around, there are several charts. So turn over and look for the one that looks like the graphs on the back that go up. This is the status of the Kansas budget from 2000 to 2015. So these are not where we go in the future. This is where we've been and where we are right now. The red line in that graph is the expenditures, and it ends up at the end of that graph with what spending was approved for 2015. The fiscal year in Kansas is always from July 1 to June 30th. So 2014 ended on July 1 of this year. So we are currently in the 2015 budget year. So that red dot is the approved spending, and that green dot is the amount of money that we are expecting to take in for 2015. Of course, we don't know what that number is going to be. That's based on an estimate. I sat on those revenue estimating groups for almost 8 years, and if we hit it within 1%, we always said, wow, we did pretty good. And I'm going to be watching this afternoon when the revenue estimates come out, because I'm suspecting that we're going to be down again, maybe as much as $20 million, because our revenues have not been coming in and keeping pace with the expectation, even as we continue to adjust those numbers. But what you need to look at when you see that, and I agree 100% with Mr. Trabert, that the reason we got the Moody's downgrade is that we have a structural imbalance in the budget at this point in time. That's exactly what they said. And you can see that structural imbalance in that gap in 2015 between the amount of expenditures we are on track to make and the amount of revenue that we expect to receive. The wrinkle in all of this is that Kansas has a balanced budget amendment in its constitution, and we simply are prohibited by the state constitution from spending any more than we take in. So in those years when the red line was higher than the green line, that meant that we had reserves that were available to cover that difference. But as we have begun to eat up our reserves and they have gotten lower and lower, we're going to have a problem. So there is a likelihood, and most people that watch this budget would agree, that before the end of this fiscal year, if revenue continues on the trajectory that it's on now, the governor is going to have to order some substantial cuts to bring that in line, because we cannot have an ending balance. I started working for Kathleen Sebelius, and that was a scary year, because in that 2002 year, you can see that expenses were high and revenues dropped. And in 2003, we got down to, we spent the balances, and it was pretty darn close. We have had several other times like that, notably in 2010. And you can see that revenues fell for 3 straight years in a row, and that has never happened in the Kansas budget before. And when the falling revenues eclipsed the balances that were there, that was when the state decided that it had no choice but to issue a sales tax increase. And that took place in 2010 in the legislative session, and it kicked in July of that year. So the upswing in revenues is due to the sales tax increase that was supposed to go away after 3 years, but has subsequently been enacted at a slightly lower level to continue. There are 2 things that the state has to buy that it always has to pay for, regardless of the cost. It has to pay for Medicaid, and Medicaid costs are going up because healthcare costs are going up. And those as a percent of the budget, and you can see on the pie chart on the back of that sheet that there is a small, it's actually not so small, a big orange slice out of that pie that's Medicaid. We have to do that. And as that increases, it becomes a significant problem in the budget. The other thing that we have to pay is that we have to pay capers. Even if we move to a 401k program, we would still have to fill up and meet the actuarial requirements for the people that are currently in the program. So whether you have a different kind of retirement program or you have the same defined benefit program, which a lot of people are thinking maybe is not as sustainable as it used to be, those are costs that the state is always going to have. So when you look at those as a function of what's going on, balancing the budget means you don't have everything on the table. You have to pay Medicaid, you have to pay those CAPERS costs. And so then in the pie chart, you can see what's left. I thought there were three choices that you had. You can cut spending. Question becomes, where do you cut? You can raise taxes, and the question becomes how much and which tax, or you can generate more income from growth. And whether or not you have the right mix of taxes is whether or not you're going to be able to generate that from growth. When you look at how to replace that lost revenue, you can see on the pie chart that education is roughly half of everything that we've got. Post-secondary education, you should appreciate that. You're the beneficiary of that, even though your fees are going high and your tuition is another 12%. You've got the Medicaid costs that are in there, and there are very little discretionary choices. I'd like to share with you for just a minute a comment from the International Tax Professionals and Economic Policy Group. They were projecting if Kansas was going to completely get rid of the income tax, what would it take to replace that as a revenue source? If 25% of the revenue lost from an income tax, when we get to zero, were made up through a sales tax rate increase, the poorest 40% of Kansans would see a net tax hike from this change, and we'd go from 6.3% to 8.1%. Now you can look on the other side of that sheet with the pie chart, and you can see how much comes from income tax and how much is coming from sales tax. We always talk about income tax, sales tax, and property taxes, but for the state sources, the ones that we're looking at in the general fund are these two. They also estimated if we had to make up 50% of that revenue with a sales tax hike, we'd go from 6.3 to 9.9. And if every dime of the income tax that were cut had to be made up by sales tax, we'd have a sales tax rate of 13.5%, which I think most people would not want to do. Throwing your way out of a hole is not an easy thing to do. The hope was that we were going to see a lot of growth. This was the shot of adrenaline that the governor referred to. Whether it's slow growth or fast growth, the hope was that it would make that up. The problem that we're running into is that the jobs that get the benefit of the tax plan are not the jobs that are not the beneficiaries that are creating new jobs. For example, one of our provisions in the current tax plan is not to tax pass-through income. And we made a choice in Kansas not to reduce business taxes, but literally to reduce personal income taxes. So most of these people who are getting that benefit are not primary job creators. They certainly aren't small businesses, as was often stated in that. The vast majority of those who get a personal income tax cut are probably in no position to create small business jobs. And those are statistics and facts that come from a variety of sources that have done studies on this. I thought it was interesting, Mr. Trabert, that you were quoting about the PEA program. I had great concerns when we passed that program that it was providing benefits to people who weren't going to produce any jobs as a result of it. So not every incentive works, and we don't have a good history in this state of examining which ones worked and which ones didn't. So I'm glad to see that you're looking at getting rid of some of those. I wondered why you didn't just get rid of the PEA program altogether, since your study said it didn't work, but that would have certainly been my choice. I'm going to just make one more general comment and then close and give you all a chance to ask some questions. People from both sides of the spectrum politically, economists and so forth, have commented on the Kansas tax reform measure that we passed. And people have been asking, okay, why is this approach bad? Why doesn't it work? Good tax reform broadens the base and lowers the rates. I think everybody can support that. That's not what happened in this. The legislature took out the broaden the base. They just passed a tax cut. They didn't cut spending. And what you were ending up with is a hole. And that's what we're seeing right now, is this big hole and no plan to get out of it. When you exempt pass-through entities, if you own a business, you're not going to pay any tax. But if you're a wage earner, you are going to be taxed. And that's an incentive to game the tax system without doing anything productive for the economy. The law that we have in place on taxes is currently beneficial to high-income taxpayers and harmful to low. And it doesn't help the middle very much either. It creates inequities and tax avoidance. The worst impact is when the tax rates begin to decline. The whole idea of this tax bill was to jumpstart the economy, but evidence suggests that there's little benefit to the economy, and if there is one, so far it is small. The real problem here is that the tax plan as it currently exists and will continue to decline, so revenues will continue to go down. It costs so much money that it makes it harder for Kansas to make the other kinds of investments that are important in a strong economy, like education and infrastructure. How do you sustain funding for top quality school systems when you don't have the tax dollars to do it? Mr. Trabert, I hope your system works. I want to play with the numbers. I kind of like the idea of your little tax calculator. So I'm glad you're going to put that up there. But it looked to me like we're reducing the amount of money that we spend on transportation and infrastructure. We're cutting back on some of the incentives like the Kansas Bioscience Authority. That law, when it was originally passed, projected huge expenditures to them. People quickly began to see that was overdone and scaled it back. But certainly the growth in Kansas that's coming from the bioscience industry is worth protecting and funding. So how would I fix this? I would return to a balanced tax system that's broad-based, has a mix of income, property, and sales. I would reverse the pass-through entity exemptions. I would invest in transportation infrastructure and public education. I would expand Medicaid to help rural hospitals and provide health coverage to thousands of Kansans because that has an economic benefit. And I would be sure that we targeted our tax incentives only to growth-producing businesses. So those would be my comments, and thank you very much for allowing me here.
Make a few comments. If we have time for a few questions, we'll do that. If not, they will be available outside for after a few minutes as well.
Very quickly, I can't do everything that Joan said. I want to again thank Joan for being here, because this is what you just saw is a rare opportunity to hear different opinions. She mentioned Wayne Gosen. I really wish Wayne was here, because every time I invite him to come out and do this, he ignores us. This piece that he published, whoops, I brought the wrong one. On his education finance, we've completely debunked it, and I'll be happy to send you a link to it, because he uses a lot of information that simply isn't true, and we use government data to show that. We're trying to find solutions. I don't think raising someone's taxes, and I appreciate Joan at least putting out something saying that she would raise your taxes. She would implement the reverse the pass-through, which would be probably the worst thing that we can do if we really want to have, she said, targeted incentives at businesses that are going to do it. You're taking away those incentives. Now, I wouldn't have done the tax plan the way I did, provide some testimony that we would have done it differently. But she's also talking about raising income taxes. Well, I actually No, we didn't. This is some other politicians are talking about, when they talk about freezing an income tax, what that would do is raise income taxes on the lowest wage earners by about 7%, according to Kansas legislative research. We're not talking about spending less on transportation. Yes, we would spend less, but that doesn't mean we have fewer roads. You have the same product. You have roads. You have schools. You have the same or better quality service. We do that at a better cost. We don't run surpluses. We use that money wisely. By the way, we can't take it out completely now. I think we mentioned that in the paper because when they get the peak benefits, they get it for a period of time. So yeah, we do want to eliminate that when all those benefits are cut off. Absolutely, absolutely. So, and I will be happy. I'm sure we got a little bit of a late start, but happy to stay around and answer questions for anybody who can go out there and use the room.
30 seconds. At the end of the day, the value of the budget is the quality of the services that you produce. And I think you have to decide, when you get these efficiencies and reduce these spendings, are you going to get a product that you're proud of? Look at Texas. Yes.